Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for allowing me to read this wonderful paper. I want to apologize in advance for my somewhat congested state, but I hope I'll make it. In her detailed and thoughtful analysis of Arnon Goldfinger's 2011 documentary, The Flat Hadira, Ravit Reichman has done us the enormous service of drawing our attention to a particular moment of historical transition we are inhabiting. In the last decade or so, we have watched as the aftermath of the Nazi genocide of the Jews, once a reckoning and disposition of the fates of people and their habits, the mourning and reassembling of families and communities, has become a reckoning and disposition of the fates of things. As both the refugees and survivors of that genocide and the war criminals who were that genocide's agents and instruments, now scattered around the globe, have reached the end of their normal lifetimes, what has emerged is what Ravit calls second-wave justice, in which the legal aftermath of trauma has been played out in the realm of property. And while we might share the sense of ethical and political apprehension articulated by Abraham Foxman, says, I fear that all the talk about Holocaust-era assets is skewing the Holocaust, making the century's last word on the Holocaust that the Jews died not because they were Jews, but because they had bank accounts, gold, art, and property. I want to suggest that Ravit's reading of the film, in inviting us to attend to both the movement of people to things and to the legal and ontological differences among types of things, opens the way for a more, not less, capacious model of political and social legibility and value. To the degree that we look from people to the things they carried from one life to a radically different sort of life, we come to recognize that the force of things to lie in the fact of their persistence that entices with the promise that it might repair the violence of murderously ruptured lives by tying together before and after with the comforting familiarity of gold-embossed tea set or a favorite spoon, even as those objects register the insurmountable discrepancy between then and now, a discrepancy that must be compensated for. But the narrative of The Flat turns not simply on the general fact that stuff has been lovingly transported by the director's grandparents from their pre-war Berlin home to their Tel Aviv apartment, but upon the discovery by the director and his siblings of a specific thing, a newspaper clipping that is made the object of fiercely divergent readings, extrapolating radically different social and political consequences. Given this turn, I want to suggest that the film offers a vision in which things exceed their functions as sites of memory or economic value. The endurance of this particular newspaper allows us to begin to recognize the paradoxes of a particularly vexed notion of political sovereignty at the heart of the Israeli state. In his editor's introduction of a 2001 special issue devoted to thing theory, Bill Brown offers the following account of the differences between objects and things. This is Brown. We begin to confront the thingness of objects when they stop working for us, when the drill breaks, when the car stalls, when the windows get filthy, when their flow within the circuits of production and distribution, consumption and exhibition has been arrested, however momentarily. The story of objects asserting themselves as things, then, is the story of a changed relation to the human subject, and thus the story of how reality names less an object than a particular subject-object relation. In the terms laid out by Brown, the leather-bound volumes of Goethe, Findersickle figurines, and heaps of scars Arnon Goldfinger carries out of his grandparents' apartment in plastic garbage bags left to be picked up by the next morning's garbage collectors, decidedly register the cultural shift from objects to things. Only weeks ago, both instantiation and ineffable sign of European high culture, they are transmuted with the death of Gerda Tuchler into stuff no one can quite imagine finding use for again, yet are reluctant to toss away too quickly, unhandled or unreviewed. And if this fate as heaped detritus viewed on its own would seem to point backward to a moment before thingness, when Gerda would have swung open her closet door to choose from the bulging array of options the perfect scarf to set off the dress she was wearing, the fact that the objects, the film insists, the objects themselves were so lovingly handled by their owner because they traveled from Berlin to Tel Aviv, even as much of who she was stayed behind, suggests Gerda's stuff have exchanged one form of thingness for another. what more radical disruption to the relation between subject and objects than that subjects should come to stand in for the people who once, in some uninterrupted life, used them without second thought. In the taxonomy she elaborates, Revit invites us to take note of two different sorts of things. On the one hand, the looted artworks, real estate, and bank accounts whose value is self-evident and near universal. And on the other hand, the mundane stuff of living and remembering that we have already discussed, of value to no one but their owners and those who value those owners' valuings. That most legal restitution cases have been waged in relation to the first sort ought to come as no surprise to anyone, because there exists a multitude of mechanisms for reckoning the value of such things. The process of restoring the value of what individuals have lost can be relatively transparent and straightforward. The fact we might plausibly attribute apparent universality of value to the existence of global art and real estate markets, or to something we might call the aesthetic, is an interesting fact worth thinking about, though not something that will be the focus of my attention here today. In this taxonomy of objects, we glimpse the affective tension animating things, at least in Brown's theory of them. Like works of art whose value is instantly and inarguably evident to geopolitical enemies who agree on virtually nothing else, things entice with the promise of a stability capable of withstanding the death of a parent and the end of an empire. Like the Middle European figurines that suddenly seem mournfully comical when perched on a table in an apartment just off the Mediterranean beach, the persistence of objects works to register the radical displacement they and their possessors have undergone, the breaking of the drill that, in Brown's account, transforms objects into things. Early on, in a deliberate departure from the legal point of focus, Revit takes it as her task to consider the nature of the value of disposable, persistent stuff, too vast and varied to be subject to legal restitution. But as her essay proceeds, it finds itself captivated by the film's own captivations. When Arnon Goldfinger and his mother Hannah uncover a yellowed copy of a Nazi newspaper that tells the story of a high-ranking SS officer and his wife, Leopold and Goethe von Mildelstein, who traveled to Palestine to investigate the viability of the sort of Jewish state that might advance the Nazis' ideological project of establishing Judenrein Germany, and are accompanied on their journey by none other than Goethe and Kurt Tuchler. The film turns its attention to investigating the resonance of this strangely enduring friendship of the two couples, Nazi and Jew. But given the analytical framework both Revit and the Flat have already established, it's perhaps worth taking a moment to consider what sort of thing exactly is a newspaper clipping, this newspaper clipping. In some aspects, of course, it is of a piece with the heaps of not quite monetizable clothes and tchotchkes in which the Goldfingers find it. Its yellowed, faded pages bespeak its persistence over decades, its transportation from there to here. The German in which it's written evokes the transparent and lost condition of nativeness in which words are not part of a specific language, but merely the instruments for saying what one needs to say. But surely this does not exhaust matters. The newspaper is not merely written in the language Goethe and Kurt Tuchler first learned as tiny children, but is published by the Nazi Party that would deport them. It is not simply the oldness of the paper that is the film's structuring revelation, but a specific article discovered within it. I want to suggest that this newspaper's particular synthesis of the material and the semiotic, a synthesis that predictably yields not just meaning, but a series of interpretations and extrapolations whose ultimate incompatibility with one another becomes the not-quite conclusion toward which the film trails off, can be seen to stand in as the Flat's most original and resonant discovery. What is at stake in the newspaper's thingness is not simply the happenstance of its survival, but the authority to assure that persistence, an authority that is finally inextricable from the specific event it relates and the specific institutional power that underwrites its publication. In this regard, the strange hybrid thing that is the found newspaper clipping can be seen to supplement thing theory, engaging the paradox of a thing whose carrying on reveals the radical transformations of the world by transforming that theory altogether. Okay, well, I had the rest of my argument.
No,
Okay.
two more minutes.
Okay. So much depends on who is allowing the newspaper to say what it says and why. When Gerda Tokler squirrels away in her Tel Aviv apartment a Nazi Party newspaper written in German, detailing the events of her long-ago visit to Palestine with a Nazi officer and his wife, the fact that that same newspaper, yellow and faded, is available to be discovered decades later by her Israeli-born daughter and grandson is partly testament to the durability of material things and the kind of affective resonance individuals, far less assuredly durable, are given to invest in those things. Yet the availability of this newspaper is just as much a register of the complexly paradoxical nature of Israeli state sovereignty. In 1943, two couples traveled together around Palestine to investigate its suitability as a location for Jews to live outside the existing set of nation-states, animated by two very different visions. The von Mittelsteins wished that Jews no longer live among them. The Tuklers wished to secure for themselves the right to persist. Why the ideology governing modern nation-states is that states are brought into being as expressions of the will to self-governance through and in time of the people who are their citizens, the history of the Israeli state sovereignty renders such a narrative utterly implausible. The Israeli state was formally constituted as a sovereign entity by the declaration not of the general will or any portion thereof of its residents, but rather as a consequence of the declaration of an international organization backed, to varying degrees, by the authority of a set of states very much resembling those that had failed to secure the conditions of Jewish persistence for much of the previous decade. To the degree that Israel traced the history of its formation back to the will for self-governance of the Jewish people, that is the narrative of the modern Zionist movement, the radical failure of political Zionism to secure those conditions of persistence in the years leading up to and including the Nazi genocide rendered the ongoing peoplehood toward which the Israeli state might and did gesture in laying claim to its newly accomplished sovereignty a pointedly social rather than political entity. This particular condition of sovereignty born of radical objection means in some fundamental way the Tuklers were, up until their death, at their most, not their least, Israeli, in continuing to see the von Mittelsteins as fellow travelers in taking measure of the landscape in front of them. If Gerda Tukler's personal history made her especially well positioned to recognize the value of a political sovereignty sufficiently powerful to allow her to arrange the figurines on her coffee table with the expectation that she might rearrange them another day, such a history also enabled her to understand and inhabit the fragility of a sovereignty born of intersecting interests of other sovereign states, interests that can swerve apart as unexpectedly as they once converged. When, in the flat's closing moments, Arnon Goldfinger confronts the von Mittelstein's daughter with what he understands to be definitive documentation of her father's membership in the SS, we might hear in what Ravit calls the daughter's polite but evasive response, anything else, Gerda Tukler's comportment and her legacy as well. Thank you very much.